In the basement of the Tenney County Courthouse, there is a marriage certificate from November 1891. It shows that Margaret Ellen Pritchard, age 14, married Silas Pritchard, age 41. The county clerk wrote down that the groom was the bride's uncle on her mother's side. The Forsyth Weekly Herald newspaper wrote about the wedding in just one paragraph on page 4. They called it a quiet family ceremony at the Pritchard home in the hills north of town. The newspaper didn't mention how young the bride was, or that the groom was her uncle. People in the Ozark Hill country in the late 1800s thought these matters were private family business. They didn't think outsiders or the government should get involved. Margaret was born in 1877 to Edmund Pritchard and his wife Sarah. Sarah was Silas's younger sister. The family worked a small farm in the White River Valley. They struggled with rocky soil and living far away from other people. When Sarah died of fever in 1888, Edmund was left alone with 4 daughters and lots of debt. His brother-in-law Silas owned valuable forest land in the mountains. Edmund had borrowed money against that land and couldn't pay it back. The deal between the two men was made without any papers except the marriage certificate itself. Edmund owed Silas a lot of money. The debt had built up over years of bad harvests and poor choices. In the autumn of 1891, Edmund brought his oldest daughter to Silas's faraway property. It was 15 miles from the nearest town. You could only get there by a narrow trail that went through thick forest and crossed dangerous creeks. Missouri law in 1891 didn't set a minimum age for marriage if parents gave permission. Marriages between uncles and nieces were uncommon, but not against the law. A traveling preacher performed the ceremony. His name doesn't appear anywhere in county records. Silas Pritchard had been married once before. His first wife, Anna, died in 1889 under mysterious circumstances. The local doctor didn't want to give details. He only wrote complications of a domestic nature in his report. The timberland where Silas worked sat in a valley surrounded by steep hills. He chose this spot because it had many oak and hickory trees, not because it was easy to reach. Winter snow regularly blocked the trail for many months at a time. Margaret's sisters later remembered that she cried the morning she left with their father. But Edmund told them she was just nervous about her new duties as a wife. The youngest sister, only 7 years old, remembered Margaret hugging her and whispering something she couldn't quite hear. The timber property had a 1-room cabin with a loft, a smokehouse, and a falling apart barn. Inside were 2 mules and Silas's logging tools. Margaret's work began right away. She cooked, cleaned, fixed Silas's work clothes, and helped with the hard work of cutting down trees and moving timber down the mountain. A journal entry from a timber buyer who visited in 1893 described seeing a young woman who was clearly pregnant, loading cut logs onto a sled. The isolation was complete. The nearest neighbor, a hermit trapper named Virgil Cassidy, lived 4 miles away. He rarely came near the Pritchard property. Mail delivery didn't reach the valley. Supplies only arrived when Silas made his 4 times a year trips to town. Margaret was never allowed to join these trips. He told the few people who asked that his wife liked the quiet of the homestead and got nervous in crowds. Margaret had her first child in April 1892, a daughter she named Ruth after her mother's sister. No midwife was there for the birth. Silas later told the storekeeper in Forsyth that his wife had the baby without difficulty, but he bought an unusual amount of bandages and medical alcohol during that visit. Between 1892 and 1909, Margaret had 9 children total, 6 daughters and 3 sons. Court records found in 1923 showed that Anna, Silas's first wife, had also had children during their short marriage. 2 babies, both boys, died within days of being born, according to burial records at the Baptist cemetery outside Forsyth. Anna herself died 3 months after the second stillbirth. The doctor who treated her, Dr. Harlan Kepler, wrote in his private records that Anna showed signs of ongoing physical harm that didn't match childbirth problems. But he chose not to investigate further, saying it was too difficult to gather evidence in such a remote place. Margaret adjusted to the routines Silas demanded. She woke up before sunrise to make his breakfast and pack his lunch for days spent in the timber. She taught herself to preserve meat, make lard, and stretch their limited supplies through the long winters when the trail became impossible to pass. The children grew up speaking little. They watched their mother's careful movements around their father. They learned to read his moods and disappear when his temper got bad. Virgil Cassidy saw Margaret only twice during those early years. The first time in winter of 1894, he found her collecting firewood near the property line. She jumped at his greeting and hurried back toward the cabin without answering. The second time, in summer of 1896, left him troubled enough to mention it in a letter to his sister in Springfield. He had heard screaming coming from the valley one evening. The sounds carried through the forest for nearly an hour before stopping. When he saw Margaret at the creek the following week, her left arm hung at a strange angle. Dark bruises covered the visible parts of her neck and face. He asked if she needed help. Margaret shook her head and whispered that she had fallen while climbing down from the loft. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ground. Cassidy went back to his camp and never spoke of it again, but his sister kept his letter among her personal papers. On August 12, 1897, Margaret appeared at Thornton's General Store in Forsyth, 20 miles from the Pritchard homestead. The storekeeper, Isaiah Thornton, wrote about what happened in his personal diary. This diary is now kept at the Stone County Historical Society. Margaret came in alone, carrying her youngest child, a girl barely a year old. Purple bruises circled her throat like a necklace. Her left eye was swollen almost shut. She walked up to the counter and asked in a hoarse whisper if Thornton could help her get to Springfield, where her sister lived. She had no money but offered to work to pay off the debt. Thornton's wife, Constance, took Margaret into the back room while Isaiah sent word to a freight wagon driver who made regular trips to Springfield. The driver agreed to take Margaret the next morning. Constance later told her sister that Margaret cried while drinking the tea she was given. Not from pain, but from relief. She spoke quickly about needing to reach safety before Silas discovered she was gone. She explained that she had waited until he left for a 3-day timber delivery to a mill in Branson. The children stayed at the homestead, Margaret said, because she couldn't manage all of them on foot. She planned to come back for them once she got her sister's help. The Thorntons gave Margaret a room above the store. She barely slept, jumping at every sound. Constance noticed that Margaret kept her daughter pressed close to her body throughout the night, as if afraid someone might take the child away. At dawn, Isaiah helped Margaret into the freight wagon. The driver left just after sunrise. Silas Pritchard arrived at the store shortly before noon, 3 days earlier than expected. He told Isaiah that his wife had become confused and hysterical. He said she had wandered away from the homestead in a state of mental confusion, caused by the strain of having babies. He said he was worried about her safety and asked if anyone had seen her. Isaiah's diary shows he suspected something was wrong, but he was also afraid of Silas's reputation for violence. He admitted that Margaret had been there but said he didn't know where she went. Silas looked at the storekeeper for a long moment before buying supplies and leaving. He came back 2 days later. He had somehow figured out that Margaret had gone to Springfield. He said nothing to the Thorntons, but his expression, Isaiah wrote, was that of a man who had recovered lost property. Margaret's sister, Elizabeth Garrett, later gave testimony in court documents from 1922. She said Margaret arrived at her Springfield home on August 13th and stayed only 3 days. Elizabeth's husband, a railway clerk, felt sympathetic but frightened when Silas appeared at their door on August 16th. Silas showed his marriage certificate and explained calmly that his wife needed his care and supervision. He mentioned that their 8 children needed their mother. Margaret begged Elizabeth not to let him take her. She held onto the door frame until Silas pulled her fingers loose. Elizabeth's husband stopped her from getting involved. He said the law recognized a husband's authority over his wife. They watched from their porch as Silas put Margaret into his wagon. She looked back once, her face showing no expression, before Silas drove away. No investigation happened. The Springfield police, when Elizabeth asked, explained that disputes between married couples were outside their authority unless someone died. The children learned their mother's rules through watching rather than being told. Speak only when spoken to. Never mention visitors or trips to town. Accept that father's word was law, enforced with his belt or worse. Ruth, the oldest, remembered years later how her younger siblings would freeze at the sound of Silas's boots on the porch. Their small bodies went stiff with learned caution. Silas educated the children himself. He taught them only what helped his work. Basic math for measuring timber. Enough reading to understand contracts. Nothing that might make them ask questions about the world beyond the valley. He didn't allow Margaret to teach them anything he hadn't approved. When he found her trying to show Ruth how to write her name in 1898, he burned the paper and made Margaret stay in the cabin for 2 weeks. Letters found in 1962 by Margaret's youngest daughter, Clara, reveal a different education happening in secret. Margaret had hidden her mother's Bible in a crawl space beneath the cabin floor. She took it out only when Silas worked deep in the timber, far enough away that they would hear his return in time. She taught the older children to read using its pages. Her finger traced words while they huddled together in whispers. The children believed their family was normal. They had nothing to compare it to. There were no visitors except the occasional timber buyer, who never entered the cabin or spoke to Margaret. Ruth later told a social worker that she was 12 years old before she understood that other children went to schools, played with friends, and lived in houses where their mothers smiled and spoke freely. The isolation was so complete that the children developed their own private language. It was a mixture of words and gestures they used to warn each other about their father's moods. In spring of 1904, Silas found the Bible. Ruth, then 12, was showing her brother Thomas how to sound out words from the Book of Psalms when their father came back unexpectedly from checking his trap lines. He grabbed the Bible and threw it into the fireplace. The children scattered, but Margaret stepped forward, trying to pull it from the flames. Silas hit her across the face hard enough to knock her down. He kept beating her while the children watched, frozen in terror, until she stopped trying to get up. A timber buyer named Frank Lello arrived at the property 3 days later to discuss a large order. His written account, filed with his company's records in Kansas City, described Silas doing business as usual while his wife stayed in the loft, unable to walk. Lello said he could hear her struggling to breathe from below, but Silas didn't mention her condition. The buyer came back 2 weeks later with payment. Margaret was moving again, though she limped badly and kept her head down throughout the meeting. Lello asked if she was well. Silas answered that his wife had taken a fall but was getting better. Margaret said nothing. Her hands shook as she poured coffee for the men. After that day, the secret lessons stopped. The children never asked their mother to start them again. They understood without words that the cost had been too high. They grew into teenagers, accepting that their world consisted of the valley, the timber, and their father's unpredictable violence. Ruth later said they stopped thinking about escape because they couldn't imagine anywhere to go. When America entered the Great War in 1917, Thomas was 22, his brother James was 20, and the youngest son Samuel was 18. The draft notice came by mail carrier. It was the first official letter the Pritchard homestead had ever received. Silas read it out loud at supper, his face darkening. He needed his sons for the timber work, but refusing the federal government had consequences even he couldn't avoid. The 3 young men left for training camp in September 1917. Margaret watched them leave from the cabin doorway, her face unreadable. Ruth later revealed that her mother had pulled each son aside the night before, whispering urgently. Though Ruth couldn't hear the words, Thomas would only say that their mother had begged them to remember there was a world beyond the valley, and to come back changed. The letters Thomas sent home were kept by Clara, who found them in a wooden box beneath her mother's bed after Margaret's death in 1954. The early letters described training, the strangeness of so many men gathered together, the food that came at regular times. Thomas wrote carefully, knowing his father would read every word. But as months passed and the brothers experienced life in the army, then France, the letters began to change. Thomas described seeing families in French villages where fathers hugged their children, where women laughed freely with their husbands. He wrote about a medical officer who treated soldiers with gentleness, explaining injuries rather than just shouting orders. James, in his own letters, mentioned meeting men whose fathers had taught them jobs without violence, whose mothers had gone to school as girls. Samuel, the youngest, asked questions in his letters that Margaret never answered because Silas burned them before she could respond. The brothers came home in April 1919, changed in ways that went beyond their uniforms and military bearing. They had seen how other people lived. They had witnessed kindness, structure, normalcy. The valley felt smaller when they returned. The cabin felt more oppressive. Their father's authority felt less absolute. Margaret was 42 but looked 60. Several teeth were missing, gaps visible when she opened her mouth to speak. She moved with a noticeable limp favoring her left leg. Her hands shook all the time, and a scar ran from her temple to her jawline, poorly healed and silver with age. The sons had left behind a woman already worn down by hardship. They came back to find someone who appeared to have aged decades in their 2-year absence. Thomas asked his mother privately what had happened. She shook her head and changed the subject. But Ruth pulled him aside later and told him about the winter of 1918. Silas had accused Margaret of hiding money from the timber sales. She denied it because there was no money to hide. He had broken her leg with a piece of firewood, then left her to crawl to the water barrel while he worked his trap lines. Ruth, 16 at the time, had set the bone as best she could, using techniques she half remembered from watching a doctor treat a neighbor's horse years earlier. The brothers stood in the yard that evening, looking at the cabin, the timber, their father splitting wood with mechanical precision. They had survived trenches and artillery and poison gas. They had come home to find a war still being fought, one that had raged for 28 years in a valley no army would ever free. Dr. Vincent Kelly arrived at the Pritchard homestead in October 1919 as part of a rural health survey done by the State Medical Board. His notes, kept at the Missouri State Historical Society, describe finding Margaret outside the cabin, hanging laundry despite weather cold enough to freeze the wet fabric stiff. She wore no coat. Her dress hung loose on a frame he guessed was barely 90 pounds. Kelly introduced himself and explained his purpose. Margaret nodded but didn't speak. He asked about her health, noticing visible signs of poor nutrition and what looked like badly healed breaks in both hands. She answered in one-word responses until Silas came out from the tree line. Then she fell completely silent, her eyes fixed on the ground. Kelly's report says, patient shows behaviors consistent with long-term psychological trauma. Physical examination refused by husband on wife's behalf. Recommend follow-up impossible given geographic isolation and apparent domestic resistance. The census taker who visited in January 1920 recorded similar observations. Harold Finch's official census form lists the Pritchard household members with clinical precision, but his personal journal entry describes Margaret as a woman who flinches at shadows and speaks in whispers when she speaks at all. He noted that she served him coffee with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped the cup. He also noted that Silas answered every question Finch asked her, including questions about her age and birthplace. Finch tried to speak with Margaret alone when Silas went to get paperwork from the barn. She shook her head frantically and went back into the cabin before he could ask anything important. Ruth stopped him at the door, politely but firmly suggesting he finish his business quickly. Finch left disturbed enough to mention the visit to his boss, who said that family situations were outside the Census Bureau's authority. Reverend Paul Stanton visited the valley in June 1920 as part of his circuit through isolated Ozark communities. His journal, given to the Baptist Historical Library in Springfield after his death, contains a long entry about the Pritchard family. Stanton had been invited by Thomas, who went to a service in Forsyth and asked the minister to visit his mother. The Reverend arrived on a Sunday afternoon, expecting to offer communion and spiritual advice. What he found left him deeply shaken. Margaret sat apart from the family during his visit. Her posture suggested someone trying to take up as little space as possible. When Stanton asked if she would like to pray with him, Silas interrupted to say his wife was feeling poorly and preferred to rest. Margaret's expression never changed, but Stanton noticed tears silently running down her face. Before leaving, Stanton got a brief moment alone with Ruth when she walked him to his horse. He asked directly if her mother was in danger. Ruth's response, written in his journal, was careful. My mother has endured more than any person should have to bear. We do what we can, but my father's authority is absolute here. The law recognizes his rights as husband. Our isolation protects him more than it protects us. Stanton wrote to the county sheriff describing his concerns. Whether he got a reply is unknown. Missouri law in 1920 provided no way to intervene in a legally recognized marriage, regardless of how a wife was treated, particularly when that wife made no formal complaint and her husband was considered the only authority over household matters. Ruth turned 29 in March 1921. A young man named David Brennan, who worked at the sawmill in Forsyth, had begun courting her during her increasingly frequent trips to town with Thomas to sell timber. David knew nothing about Ruth's family beyond what she chose to tell, which was little. When he asked permission to marry her, Ruth told him he would need to speak with her father. David arrived at the homestead on a Saturday afternoon, nervous but respectful. Silas met him on the porch, listening to his formal request in silence. Then Silas said no explanation, no discussion. Ruth would stay at home where she belonged. David, confused, tried to argue his case. He had steady work, could provide well, truly loved Ruth. Silas told him to leave and never come back. Ruth confronted her father that evening. Margaret was making supper when she heard her daughter's raised voice. Something that never happened in Silas's house. Ruth demanded to know why she couldn't marry, why she had to remain trapped in the valley when her brothers had seen the world beyond. Silas rose from his chair, his face darkening with rage. He told Ruth she would obey him or suffer consequences. Margaret stepped between them. It was instinctive, protective. The first time in decades she had directly opposed her husband. She told Silas that Ruth deserved her own life. The words were barely audible, but they hung in the cabin like a declaration of war. Silas hit Margaret with the back of his hand, a blow that sent her stumbling sideways. She fell against the stone fireplace hearth, her head connected with the corner edge with a sound Thomas later described as sickeningly hollow. She collapsed to the floor and didn't move. The children rushed to her. Blood pooled beneath her head, dark against the worn boards. Ruth screamed for someone to get Dr. Kelly, but Silas blocked the door. He said no doctor would be called. He said Margaret had been clumsy and would recover as she always did. Thomas moved toward his father, fists clenched, but James grabbed his arm. They were strong young men now, hardened by war. But Silas still held complete authority through decades of created fear. Margaret woke up after several minutes, though she seemed disoriented and confused. Blood continued to seep from the wound at her temple. Ruth cleaned and bandaged it while Silas watched from his chair, smoking his pipe as if nothing unusual had happened. Margaret's left ear would never hear properly again. The damage was permanent. That night, Ruth lay awake in the loft, listening to her mother's difficult breathing from below. 30 years. Margaret had endured 30 years of this existence, and Ruth finally understood with complete clarity that her mother would die here unless someone acted. The visit from David Brennan had exposed a truth Ruth had been avoiding. Escape was possible, but only if they stopped waiting for permission and simply took it. She climbed down from the loft and found Thomas sitting outside, staring into the darkness. She sat beside him and spoke quietly. They had been to war. They had seen men fight for freedom. Their mother deserved nothing less. Thomas nodded slowly, his jaw set with determination. They would need a plan, careful timing, and complete secrecy, but they would get their mother out. Thomas spent 4 months creating a pattern. He began making regular timber deliveries to a mill 40 miles south. These trips required him to leave before dawn and return after dark. Silas, pleased with the extra income, encouraged these trips. What Silas didn't know was that Thomas used these trips to make arrangements with the Presbyterian Mission in Springfield, an organization that quietly helped women escaping desperate situations. Ruth, meanwhile, continued her relationship with David Brennan despite her father's prohibition. They met in town during supply runs, always briefly, always carefully. David secured a small house near the sawmill and agreed to provide temporary shelter if needed. He asked few questions, understanding only that Ruth's family situation was complicated and dangerous. The plan required Silas to be away from the homestead for at least 4 hours. Such opportunities were rare. He rarely traveled farther than Forsyth and never left Margaret unsupervised for long. But in July 1921, a timber company from Kansas City contacted Silas about buying a large area of old-growth oak on the North Ridge. The negotiation required Silas to meet their representative at a property line 12 miles away, then walk the boundary to look at the trees. Thomas offered to go with his father, but Silas refused. He wanted Thomas to continue work on a separate harvest. The meeting was scheduled for July 19th, early morning. Silas would need to leave before dawn and wouldn't return until afternoon at the earliest. It was the opportunity they had been waiting for. Margaret knew nothing about the plan until the morning itself. Ruth feared her mother might accidentally reveal something through her behavior, a glance or gesture that Silas would interpret correctly. Only after Silas left into the pre-dawn darkness did Ruth wake Margaret and explain quickly what was about to happen. Margaret's first response was fear. She protested that Silas would find her, that he would hurt the children for helping her, that escape was impossible. Ruth gripped her mother's shoulders and spoke with fierce urgency. They had 3 hours, maybe 4. A wagon was coming. Margaret had to choose right now whether she wanted to spend whatever years remained to her in this valley or take the risk of leaving. Thomas arrived with the wagon at 6. They had borrowed it from a sympathetic farmer who asked no questions when Thomas paid him double the rental fee. Margaret moved slowly, still weak from months of poor health. Her injuries from March were still affecting her balance. Ruth packed a small canvas bag with Margaret's few possessions. Letters her children had written, photographs of her own mother, the wedding ring Sarah had worn before she died. Margaret paused at the cabin door, looking back at the space that had been her prison for 3 decades. Ruth touched her arm gently. There was no time for reflection. They had to move. The trip to Springfield took 8 hours, the wagon following back roads to avoid any chance of running into Silas. Margaret said little during the trip. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her eyes distant. When they finally reached the Presbyterian Mission on Kimbrough Avenue, the director, Helen Whitfield, met them at the door. She took one look at Margaret and immediately called for the mission's doctor. Dr. Sarah Lindstrom's examination report, kept in the mission's archives, lists decades of systematic abuse. Badly healed broken bones, evidence of repeated head trauma, severe poor nutrition, and damage consistent with long exposure to violence. Margaret was 44 years old, but her body showed the wear of someone far older. Silas discovered Margaret's absence when he came back to the homestead that afternoon. According to James, who stayed at the property, his father stood in the empty cabin for several minutes without speaking. Then he carefully searched the place, finding the missing bag, noting which children were absent. When James refused to provide information, Silas hit him once across the face and left for Forsyth. He went directly to the county courthouse, showing his marriage certificate to the clerk and demanding help in getting his wife back. The clerk, a young man named Porter Hastings, later testified that Silas showed no emotion beyond cold determination. He claimed Margaret was mentally unstable and needed his care. Missouri law gave husbands broad authority over their wives, and Silas intended to use that authority fully. But things had changed in ways Silas didn't yet understand. In 1919, while he had been isolated in his valley, Missouri had quietly changed its marriage laws. The new law made marriages between uncles and nieces invalid from their beginning. The change had received little publicity, passing during the chaos of post-war legislative sessions, but it existed in the legal code nonetheless. Helen Whitfield at the Presbyterian Mission knew about this change. When Silas arrived in Springfield 3 days after Margaret's escape, demanding entry and threatening legal action, Whitfield calmly told him that his marriage had no legal standing. She had already talked with a lawyer, Marcus Feldman, who specialized in family law. Feldman filed paperwork with the Greene County Court, seeking formal annulment and protection for Margaret. Silas hired his own lawyer, arguing that the law couldn't be applied backward in time, that his marriage had been legal when performed, that 30 years of living together established common law rights even if the original ceremony was now considered invalid. The case went before Judge Raymond Blackwell in February 1922. The trial lasted 3 days. Witnesses testified about Margaret's condition, about the decades of isolation and abuse, about the systematic control Silas had maintained. Dr. Lindstrom presented medical evidence. Reverend Stanton provided his journal entries. Even Isaiah Thornton traveled from Forsyth to describe Margaret's desperate attempt to escape in 1897. Margaret herself testified on the final day. She spoke quietly, frequently pausing to collect herself, but her account was devastating in its detail. She described the forced marriage, the violence, the children born into captivity, the years of being told she had no rights and no options. When Silas's lawyer tried to portray her as a willing participant in the marriage, Margaret looked directly at the judge and said simply, "I was 14 years old. My father sold me to settle a debt. I have not had a willing moment in 30 years. Judge Blackwell's ruling came quickly. He annulled the marriage, citing both the law's invalidity and what he called sustained moral wrongdoing and prolonged abuse of family trust. The court ordered Silas to stay away from Margaret and prohibited any contact. Silas sat motionless as the verdict was read, his face unreadable. He returned to the valley and continued working his timber land. His sons refused to speak with him. Ruth married David Brennan 3 months later, and Silas was not invited. When neighbors occasionally asked about his wife, he said only that she had left him. He died in December 1924 of a heart condition, alone in the cabin. None of his children attended the burial. Margaret lived 33 years after her escape, dying peacefully in 1954 at the age of 77. She never returned to the Ozark Valley. The Presbyterian Mission helped her get work as a seamstress, and she eventually moved into a small apartment near Ruth's family. Her grandchildren remembered her as quiet, gentle, and prone to long silences, during which she seemed to be somewhere far away. She spoke rarely about those 30 years with Silas. When grandchildren asked about their family history, Margaret would say only that she had been lost for a long time but was found again. She refused to say more. Ruth later explained that her mother had built walls around those memories, protective barriers that allowed her to function in the present by keeping the past contained and distant. The physical damage never fully healed. Margaret walked with a permanent limp. Her hearing in her left ear never recovered, and tremors in her hands continued until her death. Dr. Lindstrom, who continued treating Margaret throughout the 1920s, noted in her private records that the psychological trauma ran deeper than any physical injury. Margaret jumped at loud noises, grew anxious when men raised their voices, and couldn't bear to be in enclosed spaces for long periods. But she also experienced moments of deep joy that her children witnessed with quiet gratitude. She attended Ruth's wedding and cried openly, something Ruth had rarely seen her mother do. She held her grandchildren and sang them lullabies her own mother had taught her decades earlier. She learned to read properly, taking adult education classes at the public library, finishing books she had only glimpsed in secret during those years in the valley. The story might have remained a private family tragedy, known only to Margaret's descendants, except for the work of a historian named Patricia Drummond. In 1986, Drummond was researching Ozark genealogy for a book about isolated mountain communities. She discovered the marriage record between Margaret and Silas while examining courthouse archives in Tenney County. She noticed the unusual family relationship and the bride's young age. Further investigation led Drummond to the 1922 annulment proceedings, which had been filed separately in Greene County. The trial transcripts had been preserved, and they revealed a story far more disturbing than Drummond had expected. She spent 2 years tracking down Margaret's surviving descendants, interviewing grandchildren and great-grandchildren who shared family letters, photographs, and oral histories. Drummond's book, published in 1989, brought Margaret's story to public attention for the first time. The local newspaper in Springfield ran a feature article. Historians recognized the case as documentation of how geographic isolation, legal loopholes, and male-dominated social structures had enabled systematic abuse to continue for decades without intervention. Margaret's youngest daughter, Clara, was 84 when Drummond's book came out. She gave a single interview to the Springfield newspaper, choosing her words carefully. She said her mother had possessed extraordinary strength. Surviving what she survived and still finding the capacity to love her children and grandchildren demonstrated a resilience most people could never understand. Clara also said something else, something that appeared in the final paragraph of the article. My mother told me once, near the end of her life, that she didn't want people to remember her as a victim. She wanted to be remembered as someone who endured, who escaped, and who taught her children that no circumstances are permanent. She said, "The worst prison is believing you have no choice." The marriage certificate still exists in the Tenney County archives, a preserved piece of documented horror. Beside it now sits a note referencing the annulment and a brief summary of Margaret's story. It serves as a reminder that justice, however delayed, can still arrive, and that even the most isolated voices can eventually be heard. If this story affected you the way it affected me while researching it, click the like button and subscribe. These aren't just old stories buried in archives. They're reminders of the battles people fought so we could have the protections we sometimes take for granted today. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Margaret's story. Sometimes knowing that others survived the impossible gives us the strength to face our own struggles. I'll see you in the next one.